This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello. This is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine. And a very warm welcome to the latest Film Stories podcast. Quick, better cut to the main music before they charge us for it.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and love just that, the films that we know and love. Well, sometimes love. The films I tend to talk about in this podcast, well, they've got more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films that I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I try just really to celebrate the fact it's really hard to make a film. And I just want to salute those who've managed to do it. I'm delighted that this episode of Film Stories is being brought to you in association with the brilliant folks at Arrow Video, a global leader in premium home entertainment. They're known for their, many of you will know them, I love physical media at the best of times, but Arrow's award-winning slate of releases include deluxe definitive editions. They've started launching 4K UHD discs as well, including the likes of Pitch Black, Tremors, David Cronenberg's Crash and King of New York, all of which at the time this is going out are available on sale pricing at arrowfilms.co.uk up until April the 19th, 2021. They've got Donnie Darko and Battle Royale coming out on April the 26th in 2021 as well, and you can find out more about all of those at arrowfilms.co.uk. Without further ado, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going to go back to 2003 for this one. A little hint given by the little bit of music you heard at the start and presumably the name of the podcast that's on your screen at the moment. I'll play you a clip. We'll get to the story the other side of this.
Is this Mr. Schneebly? I'm the principal here at Horace Green Prep, and we need somebody to start immediately.
So how much are we talking here?
$6.50 a week.
Hello, this is Ned Schneebly.
Everyone, I'd like to introduce Miss Dunham's substitute. This is Mr. Schneebly.
All right, look, I've got a hangover. Who knows what that means?
Doesn't that mean you're drunk?
No. It means I was drunk yesterday.
Now, at the most prestigious prep school in the country.
Yes, Tinkerbell.
That poster charts everyone's performance.
Where the students are rewarded for following the rules.
What kind of a sick school is this?
He's going to teach them a lesson.
There will be no gold stars or demerits.
That will rock their world.
It's called Rock Band.
Is this a school project?
It will go on your permanent record. Hello, Harvard, yo. You, what's your name?
That then was, of course, a clip from the trailer for 2003 School of Rock, directed by Richard Linklater, written by Mike White, starring Jack Black, Joan Cusack, Mike White and Sarah Silverman. Now, originally, well, the story of this goes back to some neighbours, in fact. Writer, director, actor Mike White and Jack Black were living next door to each other in a Hollywood apartment building from 1997 to 2000, along with Laura Keitlinger, who was living with Black at the time and was also a friend of White. The three would spend quite a lot of time chewing the fat. And at this time, Mike White would tell Black about a film that he wanted to make. He'd penned the script for this film, and he said to Jack Black that it was a film he'd written and wanted to star in as well. And Jack Black admitted in a piece with Entertainment Weekly magazine that he thought his friend had lost it. He told Keitlinger that guy's in trouble. You can't just jump into the lead of a movie. He's got a rude awakening coming. Well, that film was a really delightful indie movie called Chuck and Buck, which White did indeed star in. He did indeed write. It was an excellent film. It still is an excellent film that became became a Sundance sensation and really launched Mike White's film career. Now, alongside this, Jack Black was building up the musical side of his work through his Tenacious D band, but also he was landing film roles and acting roles that he popped up in films such as Waterworld and The Jackal and The Never-Ending Story 3. He was in Bob Roberts, directed by Tim Robbins. That's a film well worth seeking out. He got a small role in Mars Attacks with Tim Burton as well. But he was also, as he admitted to Entertainment Weekly, and it's the October 17th, 2003 issue, it's right here, there's a bit of a rustle for you, that he was becoming a real fan of Mike White's writing, because White had gone on to write an indie movie called The Good Girl. Again, that's really worth seeking out. And he'd also done script work on Orange County, in which Black would co-star with Colin Hanks. It was in 2000 that Jack Black finally got properly noticed for his film work, though, I'd suggest, courtesy of his excellent supporting role in the film High Fidelity, a movie that he promptly stole, I'd suggest. He also landed a co-lead role in the movie Shallow Hal, and White used all of this as a springboard to pen a script with his old friend in mind. And as Mike White explained to Entertainment Weekly, the whole idea of the movie, School of Rock, came after I saw Jack in another movie I wrote called Orange County. Told you. He was really funny, but the part was not written for him. And I just kept thinking there's so many different colours to his comedy than people have seen, at least in terms of the movies he's headlined. I just had this image in my head of him jamming with a bunch of little kids. And while I was kind of afraid of what the Paramount version of that would be, Paramount Pictures, I couldn't shake the idea, so I just wrote it. Now, it'd be fair to say at this stage in his career, Jack Black was hardly noted as a family entertainer or anything close to it, but nonetheless, this was the idea that Mike White had. And he took further inspiration from a music CD that he found of the Langley School's Music Project, which was a record from the 1970s that saw primary school children singing along to songs such as David Bowie's Space Oddity. Now we get those in the UK, we get those really quite terrifying Kids Bops CDs. I dread to think what films they're going to inspire in a few years' time, although if it's as good as School of Rock, I can't grumble. White worked up the idea and he involved producer Scott Rudin, who I should acknowledge the week this podcast is being recorded, he's on the front of Hollywood Trade Press with allegations about his bullying, and I want to acknowledge that. Rudin was set up at the time at Paramount Pictures, and he was interested in the film that White had invented this character called Dewey Finn as a substitute teacher, and it felt right for Jack Black, and this was going to be a project that on the surface was going to come together relatively easily. So White alerted Black to what he'd done, and as Jack Black told JimDero.com, he said, Mike White called me, we were friends already, and he said, hey, I'm thinking about a movie for you where you'll be a substitute teacher and a frustrated rocker, a failed musician kind of searching for your niche in the world of rock, and you end up teaching these kids your magical music. Black was certainly interested in that. So here we had a producer with a track record for getting films made, a screenwriter who was hot property off the back of his Sundance breakthrough, and Jack Black who just got great notices for High Fidelity. The first snag, though, was that Mike White wanted to direct the film, but he'd not helmed one before. However, as he told Entertainment Weekly, he said it sucks to be a screenwriter. You're the party planner, and then once the party starts, you get sent to the back to the cave to keep writing. So Rudin, at first, well, he initially went with the idea of Mike White directing the film. He didn't discourage it. But what scuppered the plan was the music that was coming into the film, because there was an awful lot of classic rock songs coming in, and they were going to be expensive. That the actual physical production of what would become School of Rock was fairly modest, as we'll come to discuss. But the price of getting all the music in it, well, the budget was going to go up to around $35 million. And there's no way that Paramount Pictures were going to back giving that kind of money to a debut untried film director. As such, Mike White was not going to direct the movie. There was a story for a while that Stephen Frears was considered as an option. And by July 2002, it's worth noting, the film was going ahead, even though a director wasn't in place, that it was announced in Variety that it was heading into production at the end of 2002, with the report in Variety noting that a director would be confirmed shortly and a summer 2003 release was planned. As it would happen, the film would just slip from that release, but not too far. Rudin went looking for a director then that he would be happy with and the studio also would be happy with, because Paramount was happy to snap the project up, and for a while Jay Roach was said to be interested. Now, Roach had hit big off the Austin Powers trilogy. He'd just broken through again with Meet the Parents, which had been a gigantic hit. But also, Jay Roach had commitments. He was busy. He couldn't take this film on. Separately, Scott Rudin had been keen to work with Richard Linklater. At that point, and I'd suggest still now, renowned primarily as an independent film director, that he'd come through with films such as Slacker and particularly Dazed and Confused. He'd gone on to make the acclaimed but not seen enough Waking Life. He'd done Suburbia. He'd done The Newton Boys. But there was little about Jack Black and there was little about Richard Linklater that screamed commercial family movie. Nonetheless, Linklater, at Rudin's request, agreed to look at the script and initially wasn't keen on it at all. He said it made him, quote, groan even as I read it, imagining the worst. And it's worth noting as well that Jack Black wasn't keen on the idea of Richard. He didn't see how Richard Linklater could be making this film. Linklater thus passed on the project, but Rudin didn't give up. He went back to him, and in the end, Linklater realised that this wasn't a case of he was just a name on a Hollywood list. The producer actually wanted him to direct the film. He would go on to tell Entertainment Weekly, there's a couple of different Entertainment Weekly articles that I've pulled together for this, incidentally, that the film needed me in a strange way, and the context of the article doesn't make that sound as ego-y as you might take it. Mike White would back him up, for instance, in that. He said that Mike White would describe how Linklater ultimately would fight for things that he felt the film needed, whereas White said, had I been at the helm, I probably would have given in on. He was the logic police. Still, when the news broke in September 2002 then that Linklater was on board to direct with Jack Black, the pair making something so overtly commercial, it raised a few eyebrows. It's worth noting in that September 2002 report that appeared in Variety too, that Linklater had just started filming a couple of weeks on a project he'd go back to every year for the next decade or so, which would of course become Boyhood. When Linklater came aboard the film, he started cutting things out of Mike White's script. He was taking the subplots out. He was zeroing in on what he felt the story really was. So there was a subplot about the character of Dewey forgetting his young nephew's birthday. That went. There was background on how Dewey finds out about the teaching job that he lands in the first place. That went. There was a love story that was taken out. That went as well. Linklater also wanted authenticity in his cast because School of Rock was going to rely on a young ensemble to carry a good chunk of the film, and he wanted the kids in the film to be able to play the instruments that they were playing. What he didn't want was for it to be fake. He didn't want actors pretending to be musicians. He'd rather get musicians who could act, and that was ultimately the approach he'd follow. Firstly, though, there are a couple of other roles to cast, though, that Joan Cusack's brother John Cusack had worked with Black in High Fidelity. I don't know if that was greased the wheels a little bit, but she came on board to play against type a little bit in the head teacher role of School of Rock. And Sarah Silverman, meanwhile, she read the script and just wanted to be in it, playing, as she would later describe with the character of Patty, as, quote, the bad guy. And I've read a couple of really good internet pieces over the last year or two, really, that suggest that for two characters who are posited at stopping the fun, they are the two most logical characters in this. There's very few things that either of those characters do that it's hard to actually disagree with. There was talk, it's worth noting, of doing the whole film as a musical at one point. That ultimately would come down the line in a different form. But with Mike White being added to the cast as Dewey's friend, that the adult cast, if you like, was in place for the film. That Mike White, is worth noting, he wasn't a shoo-in for the role. Linklater still insisted on auditioning several actors for it, but nonetheless, he got the part. So then we got on to casting the young rock stars in the film. And the ones cast, I mean, Miranda Cosgrove, Joey Gados Jr., Kevin Clark, Maryam Hassan, Robert Sy. And they were all recruited via tapes that the studio watched and the auditions that were advertised. And as casting director Eileen Starger would explain in the production notes of the film, she said, we cast children who could actually play these instruments and sing. That they went to New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Seattle. It took 5 months to cast the young ensemble. They went to 10 American cities and held auditions there and saw a huge array of talent before settling on the people they ultimately cast in the film. There was a point where, I mean, Jack Black's schedule was quite crammed at this point. He was making the film Envy opposite Ben Stiller at this point. He was due on tour with his band Tenacious T. They were due to go around Europe. And so his original plan to write all the original songs for the film, well, that ultimately had to go out of the window because he just simply didn't have time to fit that in. In came, for instance, a New York band instead called Mooney Suzuki to write the lead tune in the film. And then there was kind of a wish list of big songs that they wanted to use in the movie. The problem was getting permission for some of those big songs. Well, some were easier to land than others. The most notable challenge was getting clearance from Led Zeppelin to use the tune Immigrant Song. I think this story is pretty well known, but it is a good one. That the band had previously refused Richard Linklater permission to use it in his film Dazed and Confused. But as Jack Black told Jim Dero in an interview, he said, I don't know if they've loosened up a little bit or if it was because of my impassioned videotape plea. Now, this videotape plea was just that Linklater had suggested filming Jack Black in front of 1,000 extras, making the case for why Led Zeppelin should let them use the song in the movie. And so Black would improvise a little bit and basically would do a grovel session on camera with the crowd on the set that day. And in this instance, it worked. And Black would say, man, you've just got to get this song. We recorded that scene with the Zeppelin song and an Aerosmith song and something else, but the Zeppelin was the only one that really infused the scene with that high voltage rock energy that we wanted. It's kind of like the high point of the movie where the kids have this kick-ass victory to be entered into the Battle of the Bands. That's a very mild spoiler there. And so with the permissions for the songs in place, with the cast in place, with the young performance in place, it was full steam ahead. The School of Rock was go, and production could begin in December 2002. Now, ahead of that production, of course, as you would expect with a film like this, particularly one that involves lots of people playing musical instruments for real, there was a lot of rehearsal time to get it all right. There was also a degree of Mike White and Jack Black, or Black and White. Why haven't I done that before? I'll stick with that. Just penning lyrics for moments in the classroom as well. But filming would ultimately get underway in New York, and they would use a variety of locations. I don't know there. Wagner College and Horace Green Elemental School. Not heard of either of those, but that's where School of Rock filmed, if you want the completest version of this story. They did a bit of work in New Jersey as well. And then after months of location shooting, the cast and crew decamped to Broadway Interiors in the Queens area of the city, where they had a classroom set, an apartment set built, before heading off to an old theatre for the ultimate finale of the movie, which obviously I won't spoil for spoiler reasons. Jack Black and the young stars. I mean, Black had never filmed a family movie. He's gone on to do a couple of really good ones. I mean, Goosebumps is a real treat if you've not seen that. But Black and his young co-stars would really get on. And he would talk in interviews about he'd done a few movies around performers who were perhaps a little bit jaded. One or two people around him were a little bit jaded. And here was a young ensemble who were just really keen to be in the film, that it was really exciting to them. And that kind of electricity just permeated right through it. The script would keep evolving, and to be fair, the scriptwriter was in the cast. And so, as Black would tell Indie London in an interview around the time of the movie's release, that Richard Linklater had certain things he wanted that he didn't think were there as they were going along filming. And Black argued, I think with the good movies, the director's always going to do a little writing, the writer's always going to do a little directing, and the actor, he joked, is going to do what he's told. But that core trio of Jack Black, Mike White and Richard Linklater were just gradually evolving little bits and bobs as they were going along. There were one or two more trickier bits to put on camera, or certainly riskier bits. The riskiest was probably a stage dive sequence that Jack Black does, where lots of people actually had to be on standby just out of shot in case Jack Black did himself some actual damage. But also, the production was just going along really quite smoothly. It wasn't a case of the cast and crew going completely off the rails with this one. Black would say, I was never the taskmaster who would say, stop goofing around, you guys, let's get back to serious work. And he said, I was always goofing around with them, talking about the young cast, and then someone would scold us. But did they ever have to force us to stop jamming? Yeah, a couple of times, but I don't really remember that being a problem. That was the tone of the set. set, and that was kind of the ethos of the piece, really. Jack Black said they told us to shut up a few times, but that was pretty much that. When it came to shooting the finale, they did bring in some of the expertise from Broadway, which was just on their doorstep, of course, at this point, just to enhance the battle of the bands that we get at the end. And the film made it into the can. It was a fairly straightforward shoot, although with young performers, of course, that brings with it certain parameters that they had to observe. But nonetheless, this one was pressing ahead. It went into post-production. A couple of little bits there. Well, the one really was the title of the film, that this had begun as The School of Rock. That's how it was written. And that was worked into the title sequence that was put together for the film. But then as the movie evolved, it became School of Rock, but too late that name change came to be able to affect the title card in the movie. So if you're watching the film, you're wondering why it's The School of Rock at the start, but on the box of the disc or whatever, using the Rolling Stone font that they had to pay for, and it's called School of Rock on there. That's the reason for the difference. It was just a very late change, but they liked the title card as it kind of was. Post-production also saw a slight delay in the release date. That Paramount decided not to put this one out in high summer after all, and it would be marked down for release on October the 3rd, 2003, so slightly out of school holidays as well. And so, I mean, it would suggest on the surface that the studio didn't have huge amounts of confidence in the film, but conversely, it seemed to be testing well, and the initial critical response to the film when it came out, well, it was really strong. In particular, Jack Black's performance was pulled up for just being such a burst of energy, a burst of life, that the performances of the young cast as well. In fact, the whole ensemble really came in for praise on this one. I think it's one of those as well that because the film comes in at under 2 hours as well, it's just a family film that just knows when to get off the stage, really. And whilst those initial notices questioning whether Richard Linklater was the right person to do a big commercial film and Jack Black the right person to headline a family movie, well, remembering those questions were comfortably answered when the film came out. Linklater would know that he was working within the parameters of a commercial movie as well. I mean, he would actually say in an interview, it went well, there weren't any conflicts, but I accepted the world I was in. If I tested badly, if the film had tested badly, if the ending hadn't worked, I would have been reshooting to try and make it work on a commercial level, he told Hazlitt. But from what I can ascertain, I've had a look around. While there were test screenings of the movie, there wasn't the need for any reshoots. They pretty much got this. The film not only then got good reviews, it got good box office as well. This was the era where a profitable film didn't have to make $73 trillion. It opened in the US in October. We wouldn't get it in the UK until the following year, with a 19.6 million opening weekend, which for a 35 million movie that was a little bit risky, well, that was a real result. The other films that were around at the time, well, Out of Time was opening in second place. Denzel Washington headlined Thriller. That came in with about 16 million. The film that topped the box office the week before, well, it was a movie by the name of The Rundown. Do you remember that one? Starred some fella by the name of Dwayne Johnson opposite Sean William Scott. Wonder what happened to him. I think it changed its name when it came to the UK. Was it Welcome to the Jungle or something like that? I think that might have been it. Other films that were in the top 10 at the time, well, Secondhand Lions was around, The First Underworld, Lost in Translation was about, Fighting Temptations, Once Upon a Time in Mexico, Coal Creek Manor. In terms of other openings, there was a couple of art house international movies also opening that weekend, but it was basically a duke out between School of Rock and Out of Time, and in this instance Jack Black defeated Denzel Washington. The film would have legs as well. It would go on in the US to gross $81 million, which was seen as a really smart result. And in an era where comedies weren't said to carry overseas, it did decent business outside the US as well. $50 million brought in at that point for a worldwide gross of $131 million. Of course, this being the early to mid 2000s as well, the DVD market was booming. booming, and so the film did particularly well there. In fact, a few weeks afterwards, Jack Black launched a DVD set called Tenacious D: The Complete Masterworks, and that lived off some of the rocket fuel from School of Rock as well, because what he was trying to do at this point was persuade the studio to back a full Tenacious D movie that he'd written, and with the success of School of Rock and the success of the Masterworks DVD, he would get that wish as well. That movie would follow not long thereafter. When a film comes out of nowhere, as School of Rock appeared to do, and turns into a success, of course, well, there's the plan then of what more can we get out of it. And in 2008, it took 5 years for the story to spring up. In 2008, it was reported that Jack Black was to return for School of Rock 2, America Rocks. It'd be written by Mike White. Richard Linklater would direct. And the story would be that School of Rock 2 would see Dewey Finn leading a group of summer school students on a cross-country field trip that delves into the history of rock and roll and explores the roots of blues, rap, country and other genre. Mike White was also going to produce it. The film never had it. It never happened. And I think really from that synopsis, it was always going to be a bit of a long shot to work. The whole idea of one of the reasons that the original movie works is just so contained. Taking them out on the road might work. What do I know? I've never made a film. Even though there wasn't a School of Rock 2, there was a School of Rock spin-off TV series. This came about from Nickelodeon, that it announced it in the summer of 2014 and would run for 3 seasons before being cancelled in 2018. Before that, though, Andrew Lloyd Webber came in and picked up the musical rights to School of Rock. That announcement came in the spring of 2013, and by the end of 2014, it was confirmed that it was definitely going to be a musical, that Lloyd Webber was going to write it with Gillian Fellows of Downton Abbey fame, and previews of that musical would open in November 2015. It would open December 2015, and it would run for a good few years as well, winning awards and getting good reviews really, and going on to make a fair amount of money across a run in the West End and in Broadway. In terms, though, of the original movie, well, the number of look back and reunion features that you can find about School of Rock on the internet, I think, goes to the fact that they really captured something here. That they discovered Jack Black as the lead of a family movie, and a good one. That Linklater's versatility is there on show as well. And whilst we never got the sequel to School of Rock, it nonetheless feels really something that we got such a strong original in the first place. Could it get through the Hollywood system now? Couldn't tell you. I'm just glad it managed it first time around. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. I'm thrilled just to reiterate that this episode is sponsored by Arrow. You can find more on its extensive range of really, really good releases. I'm sat in front of a shelf of them. My Waterworld one obviously takes pride of place. You can find them at arrowfilms.co.uk, where all sorts of bits and bobs are on sale there. I am an independent podcast producer. I am a boring old nerd sat in a room in the West Midlands in the UK. I wish I could paint you a prettier picture than that. Nonetheless, I am only here really because of your word of mouth and because of your support. I don't have like wacky things like advertising budgets or big companies behind me. Therefore, if you don't mind me asking, if you could please, if you like this podcast, subscribe to it. That helps play the algorithms a little bit. If you can also leave ideally a hugely positive review, that also helps and just helps it get noticed. And it just means I can keep going and make more of these things. If you don't want any of those things, then I fully understand. I kind of bore myself sometimes. The latest issues of my magazines are also on sale. Film Stories magazines. You can find out more about those at store.filmstories.co.uk. But I've waffled on trying to sell you things just for a little bit and ask you things there just for a little bit. So I'm going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode. This one was quite a controversial one as well. Going back to 1994, let me play you a clip from the trailer and I'll pick up the story of this one the other side of this.
What's Daddy wearing around his neck?
This is a tie.
Daddy's getting a promotion.
Today was to be the biggest day of Tom Sanders' career.
What happened?
I didn't get it.
The new vice president will be Meredith Johnson. Meredith?
We don't know anything about this woman.
I do. I had a thing with her.
But now, his entire future.
Do you have a problem working for me? Oh, Tom, what are you going to do?
Grin and bear it like I usually do and hope it doesn't get any worse.
Is about to fall into the hands.
I have a family now.
That's exactly why I can trust you. You have a lot more to lose than I do.
Of a woman from his past.
Wait a second, Meredith. Wait a second.
Nobody has to know. Nobody gets hurt.
You can't just stop.
I'm not going to do this.
Well, we'll cut that sort of thing out before it gets a little bit too fruity. It's not that kind of podcast. That was a clip from the trailer from 1994's Disclosure, directed by Barry Levinson. Screenplay for this one penned by Paul Atanasio. And the cast, well, a very starry one. Michael Douglas, Demi Moore, Donald Sutherland, Caroline Goodall and Dennis Miller leading the ensemble for this one. And just to give you an idea of where author Michael Crichton felt that this was going to end up, he reportedly wrote one of the characters in the original book with the actor Dennis Miller firmly in mind. Crichton, of course, by the time he was writing Disclosure, had already directed several films himself and had sold one or two more movies of his books to Hollywood that would go on to be really rather popular. I'm going to come to that very, very shortly. The actual idea behind the book itself, though, for Michael Crichton, he would talk about this in Empire magazine, an interview in his April 1995 issue, is he wanted to talk about sexual harassment, and his quote was, "The overwhelming majority of cases of sexual harassment are of a man harassing a woman, and therefore it's very easy to slip into the notion that the woman is always the victim and the man is always the villain." Just leave that. Okay, he explained of his idea, therefore, of Disclosure, that he felt that if he flipped it, it added to the complexity of it all. It made it more intriguing, and it certainly made it tabloid fodder as well. And so he started piecing together a book that was telling the story of a man who'd been sexually harassed by a woman. The story that the book was up for sale for the movie rights, well, that broke at the end of 1992. And at this stage, just to put into the context where Crichton was at this point, Jurassic Park was in production, Rising Sun was in production. Both of those would come along in 1993. But at this point, I mean, he'd enjoyed success with the novels, certainly, but the films hadn't come out. He'd done films like The Andromeda Strain, for instance, and Westworld, and they'd been successful, but nowhere near on the scale of what was going to happen the year after. Nonetheless, as a Variety report noted, with Jurassic Park and Rising Sun packing some serious buzz ahead of their release the following year, Variety wrote that Crichton's CAA agent, that's Creative Artist Agency, Bob Bookman, doesn't expect to see the manuscript of the book until the beginning of next year, so that would be the start of 1993, at the earliest. However, Variety also added that sources said Bookman's phone has been ringing off the hook with calls from paranoid types worried they're being aced out of seeing the material. Basically, Hollywood knew that Crichton had a new book, knew that the movie rights were up for sale, and this was a bidding war that was going to involve lots of studios, and people were worried not being part of it. Because Crichton had been through this kind of bidding war before. So if you go back to Jurassic Park, when the movie rights for that were sold, there were 4 different studios and 4 directors who were bidding for that, and he ultimately, of course, would go with Steven Spielberg. That would prove to be quite a successful decision. There was a bidding war too for Rising Sun, perhaps not quite as impassioned, but 20th Century Fox would pick that one up. And in the case of the book that at this point didn't have a title but would become known as Disclosure, the bidding began. In the end, the original story was that the rights were sold for $1 million before the book was even out. However, digging into this a bit more, the full deal to Crichton actually was worth $3.5 million, because with this one, he would also produce the film. He'd be in line to write the screenplay for the movie as well. And so he was pocketing several million before the thing was actually finished. Now, this is a little bit of a double-edged sword. John Grisham, notably in the 90s, he sold the rights to The Chamber before he'd finished the book. And in the writing of the book, he went very much against what he'd originally thought the story was going to be, then got quite annoyed when movie executives started giving him suggestions for how he could write his book. And I wrote about this on the Film Stories website. But in the case of Disclosure, no one was going to do that with Crichton. He was left to finish the book. It was published in January of 1994, and several things had already happened by this point. Number one, Jurassic Park had gone on to be one of the biggest blockbuster movies of all time, a gigantic hit, and a real turnaround hit for Steven Spielberg as well. When I eventually come to do Jurassic Park on this podcast, it's worth noting that he was coming off the back of a couple of films that hadn't done as well as were expected when he got to that movie, so that was a real vindication. Of course, he would do Schindler's List back to back with that film as well, one of the most incredible years of a movie director's career. Rising Sun had overcome a lot of controversy as well, and had also been a hit, nowhere near on that level, but to have, for an author to have his name to 2 hit movies in a year, well, that wasn't bad. And by January 1994, Warner Brothers had the rights to Disclosure, the book was published, and the film had lost its first director. So let's just go back just a little, because Crichton's deal had given him some creative power over the production. That, as I mentioned, he would be a producer. As I mentioned, he would be in line to write the script. And the first director through the door, well, not a bad choice at all. Milos Forman, the same Milos Forman who directed Amadeus, who directed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was a real coup to land him for a film as well, because he'd not made that many movies. His last film at that point was 1989's Valmont, and he was drawn to this particular project and agreed to take it on. Now, in terms of the screenplay, Crichton, in the end, he didn't pen this one because he was writing. I mean, he had other projects, which I'll come to shortly, which he also had to write, and so instead it was handed over to Paul Attanasio, who had been enjoying success with the TV show Homicide: Life on the Street. They'd also just penned for Robert Redford the brilliant quiz show. I absolutely loved that movie. But Crichton had approval of the writer. He had approval of the script. And in fact, the script would deviate from the book with Crichton's sign-off as well, that the New York Times would report. The film was adapted by Paul Attanasio, the screenwriter for Quiz Show, told you, who's turned it into a high-tech suspense thriller complete with a virtual reality sequence. Yes, he did. Yes, I'm coming to that. Now, originally, even when Foreman was still roughly linked to this one, Gina Davis was said to be Michael Crichton's choice for the role of Meredith, the female lead in the movie. It's hard to imagine Gina Davis being particularly interested in it, and there was no story that I could find of a firm offer going to her or a firm refusal, but it didn't strike me as the kind of role that would fit with Gina Davis's approach to her movie. I think she's a brilliant actor. Foreman was interested in Annette Bening, but by December 1993, creative differences had reared their head and he was off the film. Now, in Foreman's case, that would put him on the path to making 1996's The People versus Larry Flint. So he'd go from making something vaguely fruity to something around the world of making of vaguely fruity things. But it didn't take an awful long time to find a replacement for him. Now, there was a story that Alan J. Pakula, who'd done things like The Parallax View, All the President's Men, of course, was in line to replace him. He just directed Harrison Ford in Presumed Innocent, which I covered a few weeks ago on this podcast. Now, I've gone through the biography of Alan J. Pakula, and it's not mentioned anywhere there that he was, at that point, I think he'd just finished directing The Pelican Brief, starring Julia Roberts, adapting a John Grisham novel as well. So I can understand why he came into the frame for this one. But it was Barry Levinson who signed up to direct the film. Now, he wasn't confirmed, in fact, at the point that the casting of the movie was ultimately announced, but it was an open secret. He got the gig for a couple of months before it was ultimately confirmed. Now, Levinson at the point, I mean, he's done some astonishing films as well. Diner, he's of course great, and Tin Men, I think, is another one of his that I really like an awful lot. But at this point in his career, well, he was struggling a little bit. He'd hit a little bit of a problem. That if you go through some of the stuff that he did, he had a run of success in the 80s. I mean, I've covered Good Morning Vietnam before, but he'd done things like Diner, like The Natural, Young Sherlock Holmes, which I'm coming to soon, Rain Man was him, Avalon was him, and Bugsy, which had earned him a Best Director Academy Award nomination as well. But he'd hit a couple of problems with the next two films that he did. He did a passion project of his called Toys, which would star Robin Williams, a really quirky $50 million Hollywood movie that 20th Century Fox backed and then had absolutely no idea how to push. And to be fair, if I was in Fox's marketing department, I might have struggled a little bit with that as well. It relied in the end on Robin Williams basically doing a skittish trailer where he was just doing lots of jokes. And I remember in that trailer it just says, well, what's Toys about? It's about an hour and a half, rather than telling people what the film was about, which I think went to a little bit of the problem with it. He'd also done a smaller film called Jimmy Hollywood, and that had stumbled as well. And as he would tell the New York Times around the time of Disclosure's ultimate release, he said, in today's marketplace, it just gets harder and harder to make personal films. He said it's getting worse. Even after you go through the agonies of making one, then you have to face the people at studios who say, we can't sell it, we can't market it, we don't know what to do with it. Levinson basically knew that after doing, even though he didn't say it overtly, after he'd had a couple of commercial stumbles, he needed a hit, and he needed a hit to be able to make the other more personal films that he'd also become famed for. It's the old 80s and 90s thing of you do one for the studio, one for yourself. He came, therefore, to Disclosure with fresh casting ideas of his own, and one of them was Annette Bening. Her name had been linked, but he'd worked with her on Bugsy that he directed with Warren Beatty, and Annette Bening was not just his choice for the character of Meredith. She was at the point of signing on the dotted line when she discovered she was pregnant, and thus that knocked her out of the running for the film. Another name that floated around at this time was Madeline Stowe, so brilliant in Last of the Mohicans. She was reportedly considered, but again, the trail sort of runs a bit cold there. And I wonder if it's just because of the fact that a big movie star came along, because star power was around the corner. Demi Moore, as it happened, she just had a child herself. She had come off the back. I mean, her 90s were going relatively well. The Butcher's Wife had been a stumble. She talks about that in her memoir, actually, and she talked even at the time about how she wished she hadn't really done that film. But she'd had a hit in 1990 with Ghost. She'd hit again with Indecent Proposal, and she seemed like a perfect fit, really, for Disclosure at this point. And she was certainly interested in the project as well. She talked in interviews about how she'd have to commit to a workout regime to get in shape to do the film, given, again, the fruity nature of this particular movie, that both Moore and her co-star in this one would have to they'd have to take their cardigan off for one or two key sequences. But she was interested in it, and she approached the role as she told the New York Times. She said, I didn't want to make a stereotypical. This was the appeal to her. I didn't want to fall into the obvious trap of the evil seductress. And she argued that the character of Meredith was, quote, such a rich part. The complexities are endless. And in the end, she's probably a lot smarter than most of the people around her, and I think really good at her job. And that's how she decided to sign her. I mean, she signed her, and that's how she decided to play the role. Michelle Pfeiffer was said to have been considered as well, but again, it's a very cold trail that I've seen one or two rumours, but nothing really to back that up. Now, alongside Demi Moore was someone who wasn't afraid to take off a bit of knitwear, Michael Douglas. He had, I mean, in terms of playing imperfect men who like taking their trousers off, he'd had a bit of form as well, the likes of Fatal Attraction and Basic Instinct. And so he was just about to go off and do a big budget film called Cutthroat Island for Carolco, for director Rennie Harlin, which a film that he would ultimately drop out of, but he figured he could fit in Disclosure beforehand. At the point he was still committed to do that film, Matthew Modine, of course, would come in and do Cutthroat Island in his place, opposite Gina Davis. And it was a report in the May 1994 issue of Empire confirmed that the casting was in place, that Demi Moore and Michael Douglas were going to give this real star wattage for the movie. And of course, by this point, I mean, this was pre-internet news reporting, so by the time it appeared in a monthly magazine, 2-3 months had gone on, and the film was, well, it's just on the verge of production at that point. The cast was rounded out with Donald Sutherland coming and lending a bit of extra star wattage in a really bizarre, I mean, he would appear in a really bizarre dream sequence moment in the movie, but let's gloss over that. The brilliant Caroline Goodall and Dennis Miller, as mentioned before. It's also worth noting as well that they lured Ennio Morricone, the brilliant Morricone, to do the score for the film. There aren't that many traditional Hollywood thrillers that he would do this for. I think that was a real coup. Filming would ultimately begin on the film in May 1994 then, and this was going to be a fast turnaround movie, especially when you consider it's actually got a special effects element to it. That the production was underway in May and the film was due in cinemas at the end of the year, December 1994. In fact, they were showing off bits of the movie at the Show West convention for theatre owners in the US over the summer. So this was going at some degree of pace. But then also it was a very soundstage driven movie, really, that there wasn't a lot of exterior work in there. It did shoot in California, Seattle and Washington, but relatively contained. Levinson was keen to play with the ambiguities of the characters, and that was certainly key to the way that he directed and made the movie. So, for instance, he wanted to get across that Michael, perhaps sensing the idea of putting a film out about a woman sexually harassing a man might result in a bit of blowback. He did at least go make sure that Michael Douglas's character was perceived as far from perfect here. That's why you get little asides in the movie that play to his womanizing past, and there's an attempt at least to the two lead characters are both coated in some degree of shades of grey. Amongst the strong performances, I really think a round of applause should go to Caroline Goodall, who's just penned her first movie, actually, The Bay of Silence, which is worth digging out, because coming to the end of production of the film, she plays the character she plays in the movie is Susan Sanders, married to Michael Douglas's Tom Sanders, but she basically she broke her shoulder towards the end of the film's production, and so she would come onto set wearing a sling. In fact, she'd still be wearing that sling when she was doing some promotion for the movie, would have to take it off, take painkillers to get through the scenes that she needed to shoot. Now, Goodall had come to prominence by Steven Spielberg really casting her in both Hook and Schindler's List, and when Levinson brought her into the ensemble for Disclosure, he did change her character from one that's really quite weak and almost not there in the book. Susan Sanders isn't a massive presence in the text, but under Levinson's stewardship, her role was beefed up significantly and changed from Crichton's novel. Crichton himself, he was hands-off because at this point he had other projects that needed his pressing attention. That Steven Spielberg needed a script of him for a film called Jurassic Park 2, which would ultimately go on to be The Lost World Jurassic Park. I've covered that in a previous podcast, but Crichton needed to write the novel of that in order for Spielberg to get the script of that, in order for that film to be able to start shooting in 1996. And so that chain of events was already ongoing. Also, there were one or two other Crichton movie projects that were up and running at this time. Congo and Sphere were both on their way to the movies, and so he pretty much left them to their own devices on the movie, although he would be a presence throughout the film's promotion. Filming would wrap up in August of 1994 then, but it's worth looking at that post-production work because I think looking at Disclosure, I've long argued that it is the most 1990s film that Hollywood produced, and I know some people will fight me and say Hackers or The Net or something like that, but bear with me. I mean, not least the sexual politics of it just feeling off, and I think, and by the reaction to the book and by the storm it caused, they were hardly sitting comfortably at the time. But its treatment of technology, which was kind of shoehorned in, is just amazing. This was the era of the Hollywood film where if someone got an email, I mean, you look at your email account now, the thing just beeps, there's an email. In Disclosure, if someone gets an email, it's less subtle if they just marched a band through your front room, if someone just turned up, smacked you in the face and then hit you with a rusty fridge freezer and said check your computer. It would be less subtle than the on-screen messages whenever Michael Douglas gets an email in Disclosure, and he gets quite a few, and I just it's great. The virtual reality sequence in the movie, I'm going spoiler light. I actually think it's really tensely done. I think it's the tensest part of the film, that for a film that was being pushed heavily off its sexual side, I think it works better as a thriller. And that's more what Levinson was kind of pushing it towards being. The virtual reality corridor that we see, well, that was the work of Industrial Light and Magic. They'd done Star Wars, they'd done all these great big huge films, and then they did a weird virtual reality Demi Moore. And if you've not seen it, it is worth looking at Disclosure just for that bit. I mean, it's just really quite something. The promotion of the film, though, wasn't interested in playing up virtual reality. I mean, no wonder audiences were surprised when it pivoted into the second half into something completely different, because what they'd basically been sold was a sex fest. I mean, the poster was Demi Moore and Michael Douglas in an embrace, with Douglas's hands edging towards her bottom area. And this, for instance, I mean, it was reported widely at the time, I was living in the area at the time, caused a problem with Liverpool Council. They took umbrage at the fact that on bus shelters around Liverpool, Michael Douglas's hand appeared to be on Demi Moore's bottom. And so the film soaked up the publicity faster than the posters could come down. This all helped as far as they were concerned. The film also coasted on stories of Douglas being treated for sex addiction, which the actor said he was actually being treated at the time. I think it was for substance abuse, allegedly, just to quote it in case Douglas's expensive lawyers are listening, although there's no iron meant or anything like that there. I think I've covered myself there. But it just all played to the politics of the movie itself. Given that they'd sold it hard off the back of sex, it's perhaps unsurprising that the press tour was just like, it was all fruity questions as well. Demi Moore was facing questions straight out the cliched 90s, reporting playbook about how a sexually adventurous woman should be perceived, and is it right, and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, all of those. Imagine those questions, and yeah, she was asked them. For Levinson, he faced questions about how women would view the film, and he would tell Variety that a sneak peek screening had been put on in October 1994, and he said that the women, quote, cheered and applauded. Crichton, he would appear on the press tour, and he would be asked a lot about Jurassic Park 2. But in fact, by the time they were doing the press, and this was like late November, early December 1994, Congo was shooting for Paramount Pictures, so he'd have another movie out the year after. I've covered Congo before. Douglas, ironically enough, would be off to shoot The American President with Annette Bening, and he would say, I'm looking forward to a nice romantic movie for a change. The film ultimately rode into cinemas. I mean, Douglas downplaying it again in an interview in the New York Times, saying, we're making a movie, not an issue. And no one was buying that, because that's not what they were being sold. It came into cinemas, about 10 months after the book had gone ballistic. And it did pretty much what Warner Brothers wanted it to do, in that it wanted a film released as close to the release of the book as humanly possible, hence buying up the rights before the book was complete. And it really wanted to coast on what it hoped was the conversation that the book had sparked. And it all worked, really. Whether the film was actually any good, well, I mean, these little trivialities sometimes get in the way. I mean, there was a little bit of publicity, just aside from all the fruity and the nookie bits, in that the press kit was issued on a floppy disk, and that was the first time Warner Brothers had done that. But again, no one was massively going for that. The critical response was, I mean, it was all right, but basically pretty much every critic seemed to see through what they were up to, that they wanted to have their cake a bit and eat it, put on lots of saucy stuff to get people through the doors. And if anything, the critics were more leaning towards the thriller element of it. Not that any of this mattered, of course, because by the time it landed in cinemas, people wanted to see it. Whether they got exactly the film they were sold, who cares? It opened at number one at the American box office with $10 million on December the 9th, at a point where $10 million was a lot of money. It knocked off the Santa Claus, which was the previous week's number one. Other new release that week was Drop Zone with Wesley Snipes. I always prefer Terminal Velocity with Charlie Sheen. Don't fight me, I don't mind. Other films around at the time were Star Trek Generations, Junior, Interview with the Vampire, The Lion King was hanging around after half a year in the top 10. Ouch. Miracle on 34th Street, I've covered that before as well. And Disclosure went on to make a tidy profit. That it cost, what, 50, I mean, it'd been an expensive film to make just because of the star wattage involved in it. You pay the movie star rates to Demi Moore and to Michael Douglas. So 55 million to make, but a worldwide gross of 212 million, of which, 90 million was in the US, selling lots of videos, and a hit on the video rental chart as well. And Warner Brothers pretty much got what it had paid for. The story does have just a little bit of a code in that, and I didn't know this, that there would actually be an unofficial Bollywood remake of the film called Aitraz, which came out a little while later, and there've been one or two takes on that as well. But other than that, I'd sort of suggest the film's almost been forgotten about, and I think the story of it's interesting because of how quickly and a degree of how cynically it came together. But the people who needed a hit got a hit movie. Warner Brothers got its profit, and we got the most 90s film of all time out of it. I rewatched it in the build up to this. I can confirm it is still the most 90s film of all time. Come at me if you want. I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew if you want to have that conversation. Which brings me to the end of this episode of Film Stories. Thank you as always for your eardrums and for putting up with me. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter as well, at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories, online at youtube.com/Film Stories. Over at the website, filmstories.co.uk is now updated every weekday with loads of features and news and reviews and movie nerdisms and terrible jokes. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, we've now got, 30 individual issues of our assorted magazines for sale. Got something else coming up there soon too, which I can't talk about just yet, but I'm really excited and will be worth the wait. For now, though, I thank you for your time and for listening, and I think I've waffled on far too much. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you will look after yourselves and stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
He can't stop!